Hello students, I'm delighted to welcome you to this e-learning presentation on the final course paper 6, Information Systems Audit and Control, also called as ISCA. In this presentation, which will be in 5 parts, we'll be covering chapter 1, which is Concepts of Governance and Management of Information Systems. The first part of the presentation will focus on what is governance, the different types of governance, what is the distinction between governance and management, and we'll also understand how controls and internal controls are related to governance. If you have to understand governance from a simple point of view, I think these are the two key words you need to understand. It's all about direction and control. Let's understand this from the images we have. The top management, the board of directors, have to provide direction in terms of where the enterprise is headed. And that could be in terms of the performance, compliance, the rules, standards, regulations, policies, procedures, etc. Which means they present the overall direction of where the enterprise is supposed to be headed. It's like the captain of the ship who decides where the ship is headed. And once you set the direction, you also need to ensure that the enterprise goals are achieved by having the right control mechanism in place. So based on the direction set, the controls will ensure that the goals are achieved. This is fundamentally governance is all about. We'll be using different terms pertaining to governance, such as enterprise governance, corporate governance. We'll have IT governance, governance of enterprise information technology. Like that, there are fundamentally there are different types of governance, but at the base, you have this concept of governance, which is primarily about direction and control. So I suggest students to keep this concept in mind, and when you look at the direction and control as the base of governance, you find whatever be the term pertaining to governance, whether the enterprise governance, corporate governance, IT governance, or GEIT, you find the concepts become simple to understand. Let's have a quick understanding of, before we get into the subject, and introduction. Now you know that ISCA is critical in the modern age where information technology is extensively used. Quite often, ISCA is considered to be a subject which is very difficult to understand, but is definitely not so. ISCA is a very simple subject if you know how to understand the concepts and apply it in practice. If this is the first lecture you hearing and you're not gone through the introductory lecture, we suggest you go through the introductory lecture because that presents the concepts. Here we get into chapter 1. The concepts pertaining to information systems control and audit are practically relevant for all types of enterprises. And as for chartered accountants are concerned, this is important because they look at data which is available in a digital format and they have to audit this data. When you are listening to this presentation, I suggest that you be actively involved, which means you don't look at any other thing except this presentation, because it's not just an audio presentation. We'll also be able to demonstrate to you the different linkages and the relationship between the concepts. So when you observe closely, you'll find there are a lot of concepts which are hazy when you read in words, but they become much more clearer when they are illustrated and expanded with the relationship and the links. As I said, please refer to the introductory lecture and go through the introductory lecture. You may also refer to the e-learning lectures which are available on the ICAI Cloud Campus on this subject. You need to remember that these e-learning lectures which are provided are supplementary to your study material. So please use the study material which are given as the primary source of study and use this e-learning as a supplementary study material because this will help explain and elaborate many of the concepts. We suggest that you make notes as required to internalize the understanding, because what is important is to understand the subject, not remember. You may also clarify your understanding by attending the past papers and also go through the model test papers which are issued by the Board of Studies. Remember, understanding is a repetitive process. It doesn't happen at once. Considering that ISCA is considered to be a subject which is supposed to be a little alien to chartered accountant students compared to accounting, auditing, etc., ISCA deals with technology. This is about management of technology. It's about audit of technology. It's important that you need to get the perspective right. You need to get the thinking right. So I suggest that you review and revise these lectures as required any number of times so that you get clarity. Once you get clarity of the concepts, then you find reading the study material, answering the questions becomes much more simpler and easier. Let's understand with this background and context, let's understand the objective of the ISCA syllabus. This is the underlying theme. The objective of ISCA is to ensure that the students are able to develop the competence in the skill sets in evaluating the controls and also know how to collect the relevant evidence while auditing an IT environment. You also need to know how to use relevant tools and techniques for effective and efficient performance of your duties in the area of accounting or assurance or compliance services, and in your role primarily as a chartered accountant. This is the perspective of why the ISCA is there in your syllabus, because information technology has integrated all aspects of commerce, whether it's accounting, finance, costing, compliances, any aspect of commerce is integrated or embedded inside technology. So as chartered accountant students, you should know how to pick up the relevant data from the information technology environment using the right tools and techniques. And this is what is the fundamental aim of having the ISCA syllabus for the students to study. In this part 1 of the presentation, these are the topics we'll be covering. We'll provide an introduction of what is ISCA all about. We'll discuss the different concepts of governance. We'll also look at the information technology and governance. We'll look at the relationship between corporate governance and IT governance and GEIT, and we'll also understand what is the relationship between corporate governance, ERM, and internal controls. Now, quite often I found students get confused between the different terminologies of governance. If you remember the concept I said, when I say governance is all about direction and control, the same concept or the underlying theme is there in all aspects of governance, whether it's governance or information technology governance or corporate governance or enterprise governance. So when you look at the benefits in the context of where governance is implied, the benefits and advantages should accrue to the enterprise. Now let's look at the introduction of what is this concept all about. Fundamentally, governance is about GRC from a corporate governance perspective. So when you want to implement GRC in an organization, and especially in enterprise where information technology is used extensively, it's important you should know how governance has to be done by the board of directors to steer the deployment of information technology in the right direction to achieve the enterprise objectives. So you need to update your knowledge and skills, and you need to communicate to the management. This is how governance can be done in an IT environment. This is where you need to have the governance perspective. What is the governance perspective? Governance perspective is different from management. Governance is what is done at the top management by the senior management. So primarily is about channelizing the usage or deployment of information technology for a strategic and competitive advantage. So in governance, we are looking at enterprise holistically from a macro perspective and look at how we can provide the enabling information technology infrastructure to help the enterprise to achieve the objectives. With this background, let's understand what are the key concepts of governance. Enterprises exist to deliver value to the stakeholders. Remember, the key word here is the value. When you look at governance, we're looking at deploying information technology to achieve the enterprise objectives. And what is the enterprise objectives? Fundamentally, it's about value. You also need to ensure the direction. You remember we talked about direction setting and the agility to change, because the economic factors operating for an enterprise will keep on dynamically changing. So depending on the need, the governance should be able to monitor whether the goals are being achieved, and then based on that, you should be able to change direction. And the distinction between governance and management is that the governance is the fundamental responsibility of the board of directors. They are responsible for ensuring that they have the right structure of the decision-making accountabilities in terms of who is accountable, who is responsible, who should be informed in the perspective of the organization, especially pertaining to the business processes. Now let's look at the relationship between the key concepts of governance. Governance is generic in nature. Governance applied to enterprises is enterprise governance. Enterprise governance applied to a corporate form of enterprises is called as corporate governance. Now, this slide should be able to give you a perspective of what governance is all about. Now, who is doing governance and who is doing management? Generally, the top management is the one who is supposed to do the governance. Based on the governance, the CEO, CFO would be responsible for executing and implementing the action plan, and the operational part of it would be done by the lower level management or the operational management. Let's understand the basic terminologies of what governance system is all about. Governance system, you see here, talks about the means and mechanisms that enable multiple stakeholders. This is not single stakeholders. There are multiple stakeholders in an enterprise to have an organized mechanism for the purpose of evaluating the options. There are multiple options, more from the point of strategy as to how the enterprise should deploy its resources, what goals to achieve. So the top management, the board of directors will set direction. Not only set direction, they'll monitor the compliance with the direction and also monitor the performance. And primarily the focus on the enterprise objectives. Now, if you look at the word governance, most of the cases, you'll have this underlying theme: enterprise objectives, value delivery, direction, and control. Let's look at enterprise governance. Enterprise governance has two dimensions. The first one is about conformance, which means the organization has to comply with the regulatory requirements as required. You also need to ensure that governance enables the enterprise to achieve performance, because fundamentally enterprises are started to perform, to provide value to the stakeholders. So conformance deals with ensuring that you comply with the requirements, and business governance deals with the value creation or the resource utilization. So you also need to ensure accountability and assurance. Let's look at enterprise governance. Now, if you see here, we are fundamentally talking about the board and the senior management or the executive management. With the goal, you'll find that certain things which are constantly repeated, which is strategic direction. So the key word here is strategy. The key word here is direction. And you also have the keyword objectives are achieved. This is the fundamental objective of governance. And you also need to ensure that the risks are managed appropriately by having the appropriate enterprise risk management. You also need to ensure that the organization's resources are used responsibly, which is why we also have something called the accountability mechanism. Who is accountable for the resources? What are the delegation within the enterprise? Who can do what? What are the powers? Let's look at what are the key requirements of good corporate governance. You need to have sound internal control practices. The bedrock of good corporate governance is to ensure sound internal control practices. What does it include? So there has to be segregation of incompatible functions. There have been many frauds which have been committed because of incompatible functions. Elimination of conflict of interest, establishing the audit committee, ensuring we have a risk management, and generally even from the governance perspective, you're talking about enterprise risk management. Then you ensure compliance with all the relevant laws and standards, and you also have the corporate disclosure requirements. This is fundamentally the regulatory requirements from a corporate governance perspective. Why is there a need for good corporate governance? Now, if you look at the key word here, by having good corporate governance, you can monitor and measure the performance. You look at an entity like Infosys or Wipro or any other top entity, you find primarily they are known for their good corporate governance. They set direction and to what they want to achieve, and you find they're able to achieve. The management has a system in place. The top management has put the governance structure in place to ensure that what they say they will achieve, they'll be able to achieve. They monitor and measure the performance. They guide the companies to achieve the business objectives. In fact, governance is like the captain of the ship who decides what the direction in which the entity has to go. They run the companies to meet the stakeholder needs. There are multiple stakeholder needs. You need to ensure that the stakeholder needs are met. And the directors of the company are accountable for the shareholders for their actions. Now again, you look at the key word here, direction and control of the business for the actions of the company's employees who are in the position of trust and to discharge their responsibilities in the best interest of the company. These all are the benefits of the need for good corporate governance. Let's look at corporate governance again. What is the definition? They say the system by which a company is directed, again you look at the word here, directed and controlled, okay, achieve the objectives. Now you see these are the three key words, four key words which are repeated in all the cases. You also have value pertaining to shareholders. What are the governance dimensions which you talked about? We have corporate governance and we have business governance. Let's understand this a little more in detail. The conformance dimension focus on the regulatory requirements. Those could be pertaining to the regulations such as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act or the Clause 49 requirements. There could be corporate governance issues like roles of the chairman, CEO, roles and composition of the board of directors, board committees, etc. Now, these are all the mandatory regulatory requirements which are applicable for corporate type of entity. So, if you look at the definition again of corporate governance, the system by which companies are directed and controlled, it also includes the processes, structures, and the mechanism to ensure accountability. And this is what the top management has to set in place. What is the perspective of having corporate governance place? To ensure controllable risks are properly managed and uncontrollable risks are knowingly accepted. For example, let's say a new enterprise is started for digital payments. So when you're running a digital bank, let's say an online payment bank, you should know what are the type of risks which are there and how this risk could be controlled. There are also risks, in spite of having all the controls, there are also certain risks which are uncontrollable. These should be knowingly accepted. Let's look at some of the key components of corporate governance. This you have the board, there is the reporting mechanism, there is the transparency pertaining to the disclosure. The shareholders' rights are clearly demonstrated. You also have rules or regulations pertaining to insider trading and the system of enterprise risk management, which you also called as ERM. You also notice most of the annual reports of the companies, you will have the report, a separate report pertaining to the enterprise risk management or corporate governance. So corporate governance is not something which is optional, it's something which is mandatory. And this has come in place because of various types of frauds which have taken place in enterprises. Who does corporate governance benefit? Now you have multiple stakeholders. Now first stakeholder is the shareholders. Then you have the external stakeholders. You can have the internal stakeholders. You can have the external stakeholders. Then you have the suppliers, customers, the bankers of financial institutions, employees, creditors, government, or there could be the society in general. These are the different stakeholders. So when a corporate is running in a society, they also need to take care of the CSR, corporate social responsibility. So you have corporate governance, which also talks about CSR. It's not just about the profits, but also about the benefits to the society, with responsibility to the society. Let's look at some of the specifics of the organization structure. When you look at establishing governance, you want to put in a responsibility structure in place and accountability mechanism in place. Let's look at this from the perspective of the RACI chart. What does the RACI stand for? RACI stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. What is meant by responsible? There are people within the organization who are responsible for performing certain tasks, and they are responsible for ensuring that these are successfully completed. You also need to ensure accountability, which means there are a set of people who are accountable, who have got the authority to approve or accept the execution of an activity. Which of them is higher? Let's look at the distinction between responsibility and accountability. Let's say there is an engine train. The responsibility for driving the train is of the engine driver. If there is an accident, the engine driver is responsible, but the railway minister is accountable. So the person in an organization who is performing the task is responsible for performing the particular task. His boss is the one who is accountable. And this hierarchy continues throughout the organization. So if you look at accountable and responsible, this is how it's structured. So there could be one person accountable for the actions of multiple people who are responsible. But when you're implementing organization structure, it's also important there is a clarity on who is responsible for what. Only then you can establish accountability. There are also people who should be consulted, whose opinion should be sought, and this should be two-way communication. And there are also people who should be kept informed of various decisions who are taken. So there is also training which has to be done. So this is broadly an organized structure mechanism, which is one of the primary requirements when you want to implement corporate governance. Now let's look at the next term, which is information technology and governance. How does implementation of information technology impact governance? First, it's important to understand in information technology, which you have been harping about so many times, that internal controls are embedded inside the IT systems, in the IT enabled systems. So controls, if you remember the definition, controls are not available by default, they need to be designed, which means they need to be implemented. And these, when they're implemented, you should not be looking at controls implementing only from the point of the boxes, that you need to have control at the operating system layer, the database layer, or the application layer. You need to implement controls from a business perspective, from a management perspective, and also from a regulatory perspective. For example, if you're buying application software and that's supposed to take care of the TDS compliance, they need to verify whether all the TDS related rules have been inbuilt into the software. When you talk about information technology, it also requires that controls are implemented from a governance perspective. What is meant by governance perspective? That the senior management is involved in providing direction and control of how information technology is deployed within an enterprise. So it means you're looking at information technology not only from the point of operations, but from the point of strategy, and also from the point of competitive advantage. Now let's look at what are the benefits of governance. Achieving enterprise objectives, because you're able to ensure transparency, decision rights, and accountability framework. You're also able to define and encourage desired behavior in the use of IT. You're able to ensure that desired business processes are implemented and integrated, because you look at it from a holistic perspective. You're able to provide stability and overcome the limitations of the organized structure, because you look at things from a macro perspective. You also will be able to provide better customer service, a business-centered relationship, and better customer satisfaction. And you can enable effective and strategically aligned decision-making IT for achieving the enterprise objectives. So it means the IT is not implemented just for the IT perspective, but for achieving the business objectives. So the business has got certain business objectives. The IT has got certain IT objectives. Now you need to remember that IT exists for the purpose of business. So based on the business needs or the objective, IT has to align its strategy. And this is fundamentally, when you have governance in place, you are able to align the IT strategy in tune with the business strategy. We'll be discussing this a little later, but I thought it's important that you know this concept very, very clearly. Let's look at corporate governance and IT governance. We know that in most enterprises, IT is a key enabler for corporate business strategy. So you have to consider how IT is deployed within the enterprise. There has to be strategic alignment, which I was referring to in the earlier slide, between IT and the business objectives. And you also need to demonstrate the critical success factors. The critical success factors for IT is not in terms of the performance of IT based on the parameters set by the IT, but based on the business parameters. For example, if the ATM gives an uptime of 99.5% and the IT is happy about it, but the customers may not be happy about it. So it's important the business management at the top decide what is the performance parameters pertaining to deployment of IT, and they set the critical success factors based on which the IT department should work. Now, you know, when you're looking at enterprise activities, the activities which need to be performed by various enterprise processes are derived based on the IT process. This is where you need to look at the IT activities, and both of them need to be aligned in tune with the enterprise objectives. For example, let's say an ATM has to work 24/7, and this 24/7 is not as from the IT perspective, but from the business objectives perspective. Now let's look at IT governance definition. Now you see the same definition, the concepts are repeated again and again. So once you get clarity on this, then you don't need to read this again and again. What the IT governance? Governance we know is a system. IT governance is also a system by which IT activities in enterprise are directed and controlled. Once again, we come to these two key words, directed and controlled, to achieve business objectives with the ultimate objective of meeting the stakeholder needs. Now, I think with this, you should be very clear as to what are the key concepts of governance. Now, replace this IT governance with corporate governance, with enterprise governance. The same underlying theme would run through all the definitions. So don't be confused when you look at different terminologies. Understand the context in which this idea is used. Now let's look at IT governance again. Corporate governance is at the top from a corporate perspective, and this has to set how IT is governed within the enterprise. And there has to be strategic alignment between the IT and the corporate objectives. This is critical for ensuring success. And IT governance will help to achieve by effectively and efficiently deploying information systems which are secure and reliable. And corporate activities, what is performed, are resultant of the IT activities, because you require information, and this information comes from the information system, and this information system is run on information technology. Now let's look at the dimensions once again. Enterprise governance drives IT governance, and enterprise governance is primarily about two factors. One is confirm, and second is adhering to the regulatory requirements, which could be in the form of legislations, internal policies, audit requirements. The second important aspect is performance, which is improving the profitability, efficiency, etc. When enterprise started, they do not start to ensure conformance. They are fundamentally started to ensure performance. For example, an entrepreneur starts an enterprise. His objective is not to ensure conformance. His objective is to ensure performance. They want to achieve certain business goals or enterprise goals. That's the objective of starting the enterprise. But while performing the duties, it's also important that the conformance aspect is taken care of, and conformance deals with the regulatory requirements. It's important to remember that when you want to confirm, you have to comply. Now, compliance requires controls, and controls comes with a cost. So, if you do not have conformance, there are risks. Now, these risks need to be mitigated by right controls. So, it's always important that you need to balance the conformance and performance goals. Now, you take a simple example. When you take a vehicle out to reach a particular destination, your objective is not to comply with the traffic rules and not to cause accidents. Your objective is to reach your destination. That's your performance within a particular time. The conformance is, while achieving the performance, you also need to ensure that the conformance part is taken care of, which means you ensure that you avoid accidents, you adhere to the traffic rules, etc. So fundamentally, enterprise focus is on performance. And while performing, you also need to take care of conformance. This, I think, you need to get the distinction very clear. Now, how does IT governance work? So we already see this. Any IT activity uses certain corporate resources. Now, from the point of perspective of governance, you can look at in terms of The management activities will direct how these are performed, and this could be in terms of the plan, organize, acquire and implement, deliver, support and monitor. This is also called as the PBRM, plan, build, run and monitor. You need to ensure that the risks are managed and the benefits are realized by deploying the information technology. And the reports are issued on outcome of the IT activities, how IT is used, what are the key performance measures, and whether you have mechanism for measuring the performance. And based on how well the performance is, you need to ensure that the IT activities are reachernalized as required. Let's understand the perspective or the background of how technology has become a key enabler of business change. In the era where the physical is becoming digital, where the atoms are becoming bits and bytes, you need to remember just behind technology, you don't derive value. So it means value does not come miraculously from using technology. Value comes when you use technology. So it means technology only provides a capability, and value is realized in enterprises by having the right processes and systems in place, which means you need to ensure that this capability is applied and managed. How do you ensure this is applied and managed? And this is what is done by governance, by providing direction and control. So this is what is the program for a business change. For example, an enterprise which is into physical commerce wants to move into the digital world and provide all the products and commodities in the digital world. Now this requires a basic business change, a fundamental change in their approach. In that case, it's important they need to look at what are the enterprise objectives by implementing this digital technology, and based on that they need to ensure that they have the right processes, systems, and procedures in place. So technology, we know, is a key enabler of business change. And that's where now you find it has evolved from automation through information to transformation, which means by deploying information technology, you can actually cause transformation of the businesses. Now you find most of the cases, if you look at an e-commerce store, what's happening is the e-commerce online store do not have any physical inventory. What they have done is actually they have digitized the inventory of all their sellers. So physically they do not have any inventory, but all the sellers have to provide the information about the digitized inventory, and this is made accessible to the customers. And the online e-commerce store has got an information system in place which is able to provide access to the digitized inventory or digital inventory to the customers, based on which the customers are able to place an order and this delivery can happen to the customers. And based on that, the e-commerce store will be able to get their percentage of margin of profits. And they also provide goods to the supplier customer by procuring it directly from the supplier. We also know that the extended complexity of business change has grown dramatically, which means there is an impact on the business strategy, the business process, how people work, organization structure and technology. All these have changed drastically. So it means most decisions which are taken today relating to IT are not IT decisions, but these are technology decisions. Let's understand the distinction between corporate governance and IT governance with some basic concepts. Both corporate governance and IT governance have the concept of governance. I'll not repeat what is governance all about. Now let's look at the underlying theme here. Now who is responsible? Here we look at from three dimensions. Corporate governance, we are looking at how do suppliers of finance get the managers to return some of the profits to them. In the case of IT governance, who is controlling? The board and executive management get the CIO and the IT organization to return business value to them for the investment which has been made. In the case of corporate governance, we're talking about the suppliers of finance, make sure that managers do not steal the capital, which means they're looking at risk from investment in bad projects. Whereas in IT governance, we are looking at the board and the executive management, get their CIO and the IT organization to do not steal the capital or invest in bad projects. and related to IT. Here, in the case of corporate governance, we are talking about controls, and whereas in the case of board and executive management, we're looking at CIO and the organization. So if you look at fundamentally corporate governance is about the top management getting involved pertaining to the financial decisions, controlling the finance managers, whereas in the case of IT governance, we are looking at the same perspective, the board and executive management, focusing on the CIO and the IT organization and deriving business value from the usage of information technology. Let's look at the layers of IT governance. You have the board of directors, you have the executive management, and you have the IT and the business management. So the board of directors are responsible at the strategic level, and this is what governance is primarily all about. The executive management is also responsible for governance at some particular level or layer, and to some extent. The IT and business management mostly operate at the operational level. Now, this slide should give you clarity on the distinction between governance and management. Governance is all about creation of a setting in which others, who are these others? This is the management, and they can manage effectively, which means governance is all about creation of the environment, the right environment, which means at the top management, you set the right organization structure, you set the right policies, based on which the management will implement and make the operating decisions and make things happen. So governance is all about planning, okay, what should happen, and management is about making things happen. So governance provides direction to management, and they will be monitored by the governance. Let's look at IT governance, GEIT. GEIT is the advanced concept pertaining to IT governance. So earlier what is called as IT governance now is also called as GEIT, which is Governance of Enterprise Information Technology. The fundamental difference is GEIT is macro in nature and much more broader in scope of coverage. So let's understand this. So you have GEIT, which is much more broader and bigger, where IT governance focused on one particular area. So GEIT is applied in all organizations where IT is used extensively for the purpose of business process, and IT is used for strategic and competitive advantage. Now let's get the distinction between governance and management from few more perspectives. Governance is about evaluating. What are the things you evaluate? What are the stakeholder needs, conditions, and options? Whereas management is about the PBRM, plan, build, run, and monitor activities as per the direction set by the governance. In governance, we determine what are the agreed enterprise objectives. Now, in management, we have to ensure that whatever direction they're taking is as set by the governance body. Now, you'll also have to set direction, which is to decide prioritization, decision making, and management is focused on achieving the enterprise objectives as set by the governance body. In the case of governance, we monitor the performance and compliance. Here, in the case of management, we are looking at performance and conformance, and this will be to the board. Responsibility, if you see the basic difference, governance is responsible to the board of directors, and management is responsible at different layers. Now, with this definition, I'm sure you got a good clarity on the distinction between governance and management. Let's look at again governance and IT governance. Now, look at the three key terms here: evaluate, direct, and monitor. IT management. So in the case of IT governance, we are looking at IT management. Who will be looking at the IT management? We're looking at the board of directors or the senior management. And who is represented by the IT management is generally represented by the CEO or the head of IT. What are the key aspects we're looking at? Effectiveness, accountability, and compliance, and all these aspects relating to IT. You find the definition as set pertaining to governance and IT governance are similar, but the approach would be a little different because in the case of IT governance, the focus is on IT and related areas. Let's look at some of the key practices to determine what is the status of governance in an enterprise. So you need to evaluate who is directing and controlling and executing decisions. So is the captain of the ship responsible for directing the direction of the ship, or this is a rudderless ship which goes on its own depending on multiple people making direction, providing the direction? how the decisions are made, who makes the decisions, what information is required to make the decisions, how do they make the decisions, what are the mechanisms they have for this, what information do they have, what are the decision-making mechanisms which are available within the enterprise, and how the exceptions or deviations are handled, and how the governance results are monitored and performed. This will give you a clarity on what are the practices to determine what is the status of IT governance. Now use this simple concept and apply it to an enterprise, let's say Wipro or Infosys or TCS or Kingfisher or any other organization. You'll be able to know higher the level of IT governance, higher is the corporate governance, and also you find higher is the process and mechanism in place within the organization which will help the enterprise to achieve the objectives. Let's look at the senior management with IT governance. We know very clear, I think by now you should know, this is all about board of directors and the senior management playing critical roles in, there's one more term here, EDM, evaluate, direct and monitor, and primarily protect the structure and process. And also you have different levels of management who will use different tools and techniques. So you have the basic building blocks for IT governance, which is the organized structure, the leadership, which provides the direction, the process in place, and fundamentally it's about how do you ensure the enterprise is able to achieve its objectives. What are the benefits of IT governance? Once you know what IT governance does, then you know what are the benefits of IT governance. The same thing, you want to look at the benefits of corporate governance or the benefits of enterprise governance or the benefits of GEIT. Quite often you have questions in the exam pertaining to this. In all these cases, you should know the benefits are similar, but the context would differ, okay, depending on where governance is actually applied. So governance is all about increased value through IT, increased user satisfaction, and this is from the perspective of usage of IT services. You're looking at the IT supporting the business needs, responding to them dynamically with greater agility, and also you're able to harness the power of information technology by better utilization, by better cost-benefit analysis of how IT is being used. You'll also see that there is an improved management of IT and there is a mitigation of IT-related business risk. Some more benefits of governance. So IT becomes an enabler for change, which means IT is dynamically deciding how the enterprise can achieve the goals as set. There is also transparency and disclosure, which means understanding of how IT is contributing to the business. And there is the improved compliance with rules, laws, regulations, and policies. And you also find there is a better utilization of the IT resources. These are some of the benefits of IT governance. How to measure the benefits of IT governance? So if you go to an organization, you want to check whether they have IT governance in place. These are some of the factors you'll find. One, you find there's a clear definition of ownership, which means it's clearly established who will do what, and this is not just oral, this is also documented in writing. There's a relevant link to the business strategy, which means IT strategy is linked to the business strategy, which means when IT is being used within the enterprise, it is as per the needs of the business, not based on having the latest information technology or needs of the IT management. There is also the realization of benefits. Now, if you remember, we talked about the value. So when you are investing in IT, you want to ensure business value from the IT, and there is a process which documents how they're going to achieve, and these are realistic in nature. You also know that IT results in new type of risk. These risks and the assumptions and the dependencies pertaining to how the benefits are going to be realized is clearly documented. For example, an enterprise wants to implement an ERP software. By implementing an ERP software, what are the benefits they're going to get? How it's going to transform the business process? That has to be clearly documented in advance, and the cost benefit analysis has to be done not only at the time of the implementation of the project, but also after post-implementation to check whether these benefits are actually realized. So it means you have got clear measures of how IT is performing. There is also timely and accurate data for these measures, and these are obtained through a system. Let's look at governance of enterprise IT. Now, if you look at the concept here, corporate governance is the macro. Under that, you got GEIT or governance of enterprise IT. This facilitates implementation of a framework of IS controls. The primary objectives of GEIT is to articulate what is GEIT, which means you're looking at governance pertaining to IT at the enterprise level. Now, you also know the distinction when you talk about GEIT. You have ITG. ITG could be applicable for enterprise where IT is not extensively used or IT is not a key enabler, whereas GIT is something where enterprise has to be monitoring the usage or deployment of information technology at a macro level, at a holistic level, because IT is a key enabler for the enterprise. So remove IT, the enterprise will not be able to work. So if that is the case, that enterprise requires not just IT governance, they require governance of enterprise information technology. So when you talk about governance, we talk about structures. You also need to have the principal processes and the practices. And fundamentally, it's about achieving the goals and objectives as per the missions or the vision of the enterprise. Let's look at the benefits of GIT. So when you're implementing GIT, you know there's going to be consistent approach or structured approach, which is integrated and aligned with the governance approach. You also ensure that all IT-related decisions are made in line with the strategy, which means you talk about alignment. You also see that the risks are properly managed through a system of enterprise risk management. You also ensure compliance, and you also have governance requirements, which are the board members are aware, and these are met. And that's why you find when you talk about GRC, GRC is fundamentally about GAIT. So you can achieve GRC by implementing governance of enterprise IT. Let's look at some of the key governance practices pertaining to GIT. So there are actually three principles. You need to first evaluate, you need to direct, and you need to ensure that you monitor the system. Now let's look at the concepts of the relationship between corporate governance and look at the board is responsible for corporate governance. You have the managers, then you have the shareholders and the other stakeholders. Now, what are the best practices of implementing corporate governance? The clear assignment of responsibilities and the decision-making authorities. There is a mechanism for interaction and cooperation among the board of directors, senior management, with the auditors. There is strong internal control systems, including audit. You have special monitoring of the risk exposures, where you are able to identify the conflict of interest. You also have financial management incentives, and there is the information flow, which is transparent. If you look at, let's say, the annual report of a company which has got good corporate governance, you find they are very, very transparent in sharing information. So it means they are not hoarding information, but they share the information. They not only share the information, they have the right processes and systems in place. They also have the accountability mechanism of the responsibility clearly defined. And all these are properly documented, which means they're not people dependent, but process dependent. And that is the key distinction when you implement governance. Let's look at the next term, which is pertaining to corporate governance. If you want to implement corporate governance, you find this one term which is generally used repeatedly, and that is enterprise risk management. You look at any annual report of a corporate entity, you find they have to provide a report pertaining to enterprise risk management. What is the system they have? How enterprise risk management is being done by the entity. Now let's look at the definition. What is enterprise risk management? It's a process which is affected by, now look at the keyword, the board of directors, and with that fundamental, then you have management and the other personnel, and this is applied in strategy setting and across the enterprise, and is designed to identify potential events. What is the potential event? If you remember, potential event is various types of risks which can occur. What is the risk? So we know risk is threats, exploits, vulnerability that may affect the entity. For example, there is a rain in Chennai. but that will also have an effect in Bangalore because the Bangalore also may get affected. So you need to look at the events and what is the impact of that event. For example, there's a fire. So what is the impact of the fire on the data center, on the business? So the business will not be able to provide the service to the customers. So when you're implementing a system of enterprise risk management, you need to ensure that these risks are managed. And the key word here is risk appetite. So every enterprise has to have a risk appetite, and this is set by the board of directors. And enterprise risk management will help the management to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of the entity objectives. So if you look at basically in ERM, what that we are looking at, we are talking about risk, and this risk need to be managed, and this need to be managed at the enterprise level. So if you look at here, your enterprise risk management. So you have risks we need to be managed, and this management has to happen at the enterprise level. Now let's look at the relationship between enterprise risk management and an IT environment. What are the type of controls you need to implement would depend on the enterprise risk management strategy. The enterprise risk management strategy has to consider how the information is processed and what type of information technology implemented. You also need to understand the associated risks, and based on that, you need to formulate the security and the controls. IT security and controls which are implemented in an organization are a subset of ERM. So it means if you want to have ERM in an entity which is using technology, you can achieve it only by implementing the right level of IT controls. I hope this is clear. So why do you need ERM? Because you need to implement the right level of controls. What is the right level of controls? You need to balance the risk vis-a-vis the benefits, because controls always comes with a cost. Enterprises always have the challenge. There is a desire for greater openness in systems, which means we want to provide more and more information access to the customers. But there is also a need to provide tighter security. What is most important? You need to ensure that these controls are implemented at the right level. Let's look at internal controls. What is the definition of internal controls? Internal controls is a process designed by the enterprise principal executives and the officers. This is effected by the board, the management, and the other personnel to provide reasonable assurance regarding primarily the focus on the financial reporting. It includes the policies and procedures pertaining to the maintenance of records and the safeguarding of assets. Who is responsible for implementing internal controls? Let's look at from the SOX. SOX holds the CEO and the CFO personally and criminally responsible for the quality and effectiveness of the enterprise internal controls, which means implementing internal controls now is mandated by law. In India also, we have clause 49 regulatory requirements, and now recently we had this IFC requirements, which also talks about internal controls pertaining to financial reporting. So when you're talking about internal controls from a regulatory perspective, this has to be implemented through ERM. So look at SOX certification requirements. There is a section 302, which talks about management certifying whether the internal controls as required and applicable for the enterprise have been implemented. You also have section 404, which talks about the annual assessment of these controls by the auditors. And this fundamentally is about the internal controls for the financial reporting. And this what has now been brought in India in IFC, and IFC, you know, is applicable for all types of entities. And incidentally, ICA has also brought out a new publication on IFC for smaller entities, because they may not be able to have all the controls or all the controls, the rigors of which are applicable to large enterprises may not be applicable for small enterprises. Let's look at internal controls as per COSO. So first of all, when you want to implement internal controls from a holistic perspective or from an ERM perspective, you need to have control environment. The control environment is set by the board of directors or the senior management. There has to be risk assessment as to what can go wrong. You need to look at the different types of events which can happen. For mitigating this, you need to have the right level of controls and you need to ensure that these are communicated to all the employees, and you need to have system of monitoring. And this is the complete structure of how internal controls are supposed to be implemented in COSO. In fact, COSO has been extensively referred in most of the cases where internal controls are to be implemented, and this is referred even in the IFC also. Now let's look at the Clause 49 listing agreement requirements, which mandates implementation of ERM and the internal controls. So what does it say? Similar to SOX, it says the senior management are legally responsible for implementing what? The ERM and the internal controls. It also requires, if you remember, the certification by the auditors. Let's understand the controls and IT. So the CEO and CFO is supposed to certify whether the organized processes are there. They also need to certify the financial filings, and they have to ensure and confirm whether they have the appropriate internal controls. There are supposed to be audit committees which will review the internal process associated risks and relevant controls, and there is a frequency of review which has to be looked at. And if there is a non-compliance, there can be delisting from the stock exchange. Now, with this perspective of internal control, let's once again run through the definition of control. What is the control? Said we are referring to the policies, procedures, practices, and the organized structure, which are designed to provide a reasonable assurance about what business objectives are achieved. And you know the next part, which is about the risk, which is the undesired events will be prevented or detected in controls. So you have this is called as preventive controls, it's called as detective controls, these are called as corrective controls. For example, if you have an antivirus, is antivirus a preventive controls or detective or corrective? Depending on how it is deployed, it could be preventive or detective and corrective. For example, if you have a security guard, is it a preventive controls? It is a preventive control. It's also a detective control. Now let's look at the relationship between the risk and the controls. The objectives is what is set by the management as to what the enterprise wants to achieve. This clearly outlines where do we want to go. While achieving the objective, the enterprise may have different types of risks, which means what can go wrong. The enterprise has set the objective, they have deployed certain information technology, they need to ensure performance. So it means how do we achieve our objectives? Or how do we achieve our objectives? And to ensure that the balance between the objective, risk, and the performance, you need to have controls. This gives you the overview of what are the certification requirements for the CEO and the CFO. Let's look at some of the sample questions which could be there in the exam pertaining to this topic. Explain scope and benefits of implementing IT governance. So here if you see, the key word is scope and benefit, and this in the context of the IT governance. Can this question be modified? So instead of IT governance, I may talk about corporate governance, we may talk about GEIT. Okay, so in each of this, there is a particular, each of these aspects of governance has a particular scope, has got certain specific benefits. What is the relationship of governance and IT governance? So in this case, you know very clearly that governance is macro in nature, subset of governance is IT governance. And IT governance impact how the enterprise is able to achieve the objectives and vice versa. Governance has to control that IT is used strategically for achieving the enterprise objectives. Now let's look at the next aspect. Explain how IT governance is a subset of corporate governance. In this case, you should be very clearly explained that corporate governance is a regulatory requirement for all corporate entities. And IT is used in most corporate entities. And when IT is being used for a strategic and a competitive advantage, it's important that they apply the principle of corporate governance to IT, and that's where it becomes IT governance. Explain key features of governance of enterprise IT. So here if you see, here we're talking about the word enterprise, which means we are looking at IT is the building block for the enterprise pertaining to achieving the business goals. So they need to ensure that the concepts of governance are applied to enterprise IT. Explain the relationship between enterprise risk management, IT governance, corporate governance. So if you know that Corporate governance requires that you need to have a system of enterprise risk management in place. So this is generic. And IT governance is specifically pertaining to the implementation of the enterprise risk management or the internal controls in an IT environment, and that's what is called as IT governance. Explain how internal controls could be implemented in ERM. We have discussed this in detail. So you should know ERM is all about enterprise risk management, which is done by the board of directors for implementing a system of controls. And internal controls is a system of the control mechanism in place. So you have the 5 dimensions of the internal controls, which has to be explained, which is elaborated in the ERM principle. Now, risk and controls. I think this is very key. What is risk? Risk is what can go wrong. Risks are mitigated by implementing the right level of controls. So if you remember, we started with the concept of risk, security, controls, and audit. So you should remember this is the concept which is underlying in all areas pertaining to the ISCA. So before we conclude, I hope you now understood clearly the distinction between the different types of governance, the internal controls, and also how enterprise risk management and controls are integrated or linked together. In the introduction, we have provided you an overview of why you need to understand ISCA, why most modern enterprises need to have governance, especially in the IT area, because IT is important for the enterprise, is integral for the enterprise. We also talked about the definitions of various types of governance. We also talked about governance which is required in the information technology, how the information technology impacts enterprises, enables them to perform the business processes, and you need to have the senior management, the board of directors involved in directing how IT is channelized or deployed within the enterprise, and that system is called as information technology governance. We also talked about the regulatory requirements because most of the corporate entities are subject to corporate governance, which means implementing governance is a regulatory requirement, not just an optional for the management. And most of the corporates use information technology extensively for achieving the business objectives. So when you're looking at implementing a system of corporate governance, you need to have a system of IT governance because most of the controls which are required, most of the process systems which are required are embedded inside IT. So you need to have IT governance system in place. In case of modern enterprises, where IT has become integral for the survival of the enterprise, which means you remove IT, the enterprise ceases to exist. In that case, the board of directors have not just to direct and control how enterprise achieve the business objectives, they also need to direct and control how information technology is used strategically for achieving the enterprise objectives. And this is what is provided by GEIT, which is Governance of Enterprise Information Technology. And when you want to implement corporate governance, you need to have enterprise risk management. Enterprise risk management is a process which is affected by the board of directors at a macro level. They need to direct and control how enterprise is able to manage the risks within the enterprise. These risks are fundamental pertaining to the business processes, so you need to have a system of internal controls. So we also saw the definition of internal controls. So I hope through this presentation, you got a clarity on what the different types of governance are. At times, you might have got confused between the different terminologies, but just remember the fundamental understanding of governance is key to the various aspects of governance. So the same concept of governance as applied to IT becomes IT governance. The same concept of governance applied to enterprise at the enterprise level becomes enterprise governance. The same concept of governance applied from the point of risk management becomes enterprise risk management. At the core of all this is internal controls, which are applicable for enterprise, and this should be an integral aspect of any enterprise. And that's where you need to ensure that ERM and internal controls are reported in most of the corporate annual reports, and this is a legal requirement. I hope this has provided you clarity on the concepts. If you got any doubt, I suggest you go back to the study material, underline the key points, and come back to this presentation again. Look at the linkage and the flow. Once you understand the linkage and the flow, then you find understanding the subject becomes very simple and easy. So thank you very much. We look forward to meeting you in the next presentation. Bye.